Hello and welcome to everyone across the globe. I am Sarah Lugers from the Gold Standard Foundation. I am the Director of Emissions, and we're very happy to have all of you here with us today. So thanks for joining from all corners of the globe in what is really a seminal moment in the voluntary carbon market and carbon offsetting and climate action more broadly. I think we're seeing a lot of dynamics kind of converging at this moment, and as we look at it as a real watershed and an opportunity to scale high impact climate action. So some of those dynamics are represented by the speakers that we have with us today. The first is that we have growing clarity from science on what is needed to maintain a stable climate, and then translating that into what that means for business. So we're very happy to have Alexander Farson with us from the Science Based Target Initiative and WWF. We also have growing recognition that offsetting is a necessary part of the transition to global net zero. And so we're very fortunate to have Sonia Gibbs from the Institute of International Finance, who's also convening the task force to scale the voluntary carbon market, who has recently published a consultation, and she'll go over their objectives and also what they're trying to get out of the consultation. And third, we have the Paris Agreement, which is meant to come into force on January 1st, and will indeed, but there are a lot of questions that remain around Article 6, which governs carbon markets, and how that influences or doesn't the voluntary carbon market, and how we need to prepare for that and help give clear guidance both to project developers on the supply side and also to business on how they can use that tool. And so we'll look at what that means for business. We have Jim Goudreau from Novartis with us and Zelda Bentham from Aviva, who will talk about their climate strategies and reflect on what these dynamics mean for their approach to climate action. So first, just a quick word about Gold Standard. We've been around since 2003 when WWF and some other international NGOs were worried about the quality measures that were coming out of the UN's Clean Development Mechanism, so the first compliance mechanism coming out of Kyoto Protocol. And they really charged us with maintaining the highest levels of environmental integrity on the one hand, and also making sure that sustainable development, that the D and the CDM delivered on its promise. So that's something that you'll hear come through in our remarks and mine, and as well as when Owen chimes in later on today. So just to give, since we have such growing interest and have a broad range of attendees with us today, I think it's worth just taking a moment to give some background on what carbon offsetting is all about. And as I mentioned already, we do have very clear global targets, and that's a key difference from Kyoto. Science is telling us exactly the timescales that we need to decarbonize to maintain a stable climate. And as you'll see, that decarbonization trajectory is dramatic. So it means, accelerated change urgently. We also have really big, bold goals in the Sustainable Development Agenda. So we have big targets like zero poverty, zero hunger, zero biodiversity loss. And what we think is that it really makes sense to take advantage of climate action as a lever to deliver sustainable development. So you'll see how we approach that, and we think that it's a must-have and is becoming substantiated that it is a must-have in carbon markets. So we know what those end zones are. Quick look at where we are we on track? And it's clear that from a policy perspective, the nationally determined contributions committed through the Paris Agreement, even though they're expected to ratchet up imminently, and some already have, we're still far short, in the order of 32 gigatons. And that's where we really are looking to the private sector to start filling that gap. And we think carbon offsetting is one mechanism for doing so. Again, even looking at primarily OECD countries at an evaluation of progress towards a sustainable development agenda, we see a lot of red here, and therefore a lot of opportunity. If you think about how this might translate further to the developing world, a lot of opportunity to deliver verified impact to the SDG alongside climate action. So that's what we hope to do. Hope to position carbon offsetting to accelerate the transition to global net zero. And I think that's an important distinction. I think one that you'll hear Alex talk about a bit later. We're looking at how companies transition to net zero within their own boundaries and how they can finance additional climate action beyond their boundaries to accelerate that transition. We can fill that ambition gap that you saw very clearly, which of course requires finance that has not been committed. And again, in a time scale that can be deployed rather quickly because urgent action is desperately needed. And so in terms of benefits of carbon offsetting, as I just mentioned, the immediate action, as companies make their long-term trajectories to decarbonize, it allows them to take responsibility for their footprint today, for their residual emissions, which is especially important for companies that are hard to abate or that have very large scope 3 footprints. So as they're designing their supplier engagement strategy, they can still take that action now. And when you look at the middle two bullets, we're really looking at having a carbon price where legislation hasn't reached yet, but still finding some benefits in cost-effective measures to reduce emissions lower than the cost of abatement in those hard to abate sectors, so that we do have a real price that incentivizes further reductions as a company sets a commitment to carbon offsetting, but still is seeking some efficiencies in terms of price. And finally, I already mentioned the contributions that are possible to sustainable development, but we're talking about verified impact here. So that's one benefit of carbon markets, is that they're based on results-based finance, which means that the carbon credit that you get at the end of the day represents something that has been certified to have been achieved. And so you can have confidence as a buyer that that climate impact has been delivered. I won't dwell here, but I just want to flag that this is something that we've been really working on hard. It's important that that carbon offsetting enhances corporate ambition rather than displacing it. And that'll be a theme that you'll hear from Alex in terms of making that commitment to reduce climate impact in line with science, and then to take responsibility for emissions that you haven't yet abated by financing reductions beyond boundaries. And then use that opportunity. You'll see here just a quick snapshot. In economic terms, if you look at different project types, from household biogas you see here at the top, to forestry projects that have a wide range and a deep suite of different sustainable development impacts that actually translate to real economic value. What you see here is representations on project averages that we commissioned environmental economists to estimate, so that buyers can see that not only has their purchase of a carbon credit delivered a verified climate impact, but also has created real value for society in a range from $21 to $465 per ton of CO2, which is pretty impressive. So with that, I'd like to invite Alex to share some key insights and focal points of the Science Based Targets Initiative recent net zero foundations. Over to you, Alex.
Great, thanks, Sarah, and thanks for hosting us today. And thanks everybody, of course, for taking some time today for this presentation. I'm going to speak a little bit about the SBTI's broader effort to develop sort of a standard for science-based net zero targets. And I'll start by talking about a paper that we published in this effort about a couple of months ago that's really trying to lay out the sort of the principles and foundations for what credible science-based net zero targets for corporates should look like. And that's also why we called it Foundations for Science-Based Net Zero Target Setting in the Corporate Sector. And the background to this really is the great momentum that we're seeing behind net zero commitments. And of course, they're hugely valuable for anchoring global ambition, for giving us a clear North Star that we're aiming for in terms of reducing or eliminating our impact on the climate. But it's also becoming clear that there's a bit of confusion about what exactly it would mean to reach net zero, not least for companies. So there's on the one hand, this great momentum that we're seeing around these commitments, but at the same time, we're also seeing that there's a need for clarity. And that's why we started this effort of bringing this clarity to the marketplace so stakeholders can really be clear that zero means zero for a company, and that they actually do, in line with science, eliminate their impact. This is the paper that I'm talking about, and I recommend that you go and look at it in detail, because I'm not going to be able to cover all the nuance today, but I'll highlight some of the key concepts that I think will help our conversation today. Next slide, please. So the first step really is getting some of the concepts clear, as I mentioned, and we call the different approaches that companies take to achieve or contribute to a net zero target, we call them mitigation tactics. And we differ three broad ones. On the one hand, there is abatement. And what it really means is reducing your emissions within your value chain. So your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, as is established as a common practice among businesses, to measure your footprint across scope 1, 2, and 3, and then reduce those emissions over time. That's what we call abatement. And that happens within the value chain of the company. Then there's emission reductions that can happen outside of a company's value chain. For example, by investing in projects that have verified emission reductions through carbon credits. And we call that compensation. And then we make a distinction that's, I think, really emerged with the conversation around net zero, where we're saying there's also neutralization, which represents carbon removals. So you actually remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, actively reduce the emissions, sequester it, and store it. And that is neutralization. And we're saying it doesn't necessarily matter whether it happens within or outside of the value chain. That's partly because the accounting hasn't been fully resolved, but also because the incentives that it sets are important to consider. So there's abatement, which means reducing your emissions, your own emissions within the value chain. There's compensation, emission reductions outside of your value chain. There's neutralization, which means carbon removals delivered within your value chain and accounted for within your value chain, or delivered through carbon markets, for example, through nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So for net zero targets, what is the level of abatement that's expected? We're positing that companies should reduce their value chain emissions in line with pathways that lead to 1.5 degrees Celsius in a robust way. That means with low or no overshoot. So there's a clear need to reduce your emissions over time in line with these Paris-aligned pathways. And that can mean different things for different sectors. So for some sectors, we already know that emissions need to completely disappear by 2050. For example, in the power sector, almost all scenarios conclusively show that the power sector will be either completely without emissions or even net negative in terms of CO2 by 2050. There's some, likewise, we need to see the same for deforestation. There's some other sectors where perhaps the abatement is a bit slower. Aviation is one example where a lot of scenarios see emissions to continue for longer because they're considered more challenging to reduce. And there's some unavoidable emissions from, for example, agriculture. So methane emissions from rice cultivation, for example, are unlikely to completely disappear in the foreseeable future. And we're basically saying that companies need to reduce their emissions, have abatement in line with this, with these pathways. That's the level of abatement that's required. Next slide, please. So once you have this in place, the question is, what is the role of offsetting? And graphically, I think you can basically distinguish everything that's abatement is what happens above the x-axis. And what's above the x-axis is the emissions that you account for in scope 1 to 3 that you ramp down. And then what we say offsetting is for is to compensate or neutralize below the x-axis. So they are not a replacement for these emission reductions, they happen on top of them. And they're really critical in terms of closing the financing gap and helping stakeholders reduce their emissions and making sure that, knowledge and finance is spread to key mitigation opportunities. And during the transition to net zero, there's some opportunities that we understand for emission reductions that are priorities. For example, reducing deforestation. But as we come closer and closer towards the point of global net zero, it's also clear that neutralization must be what ultimately balances the remaining emissions, the residual emissions that the company has. So we want to make the key investments, for priority opportunities in the near term, and ultimately get to a point where we actually remove as much carbon as we emit to really physically have a net zero and not have more emissions than removals. Next slide, please. And one question that's emerging is, of course, what's the difference between science-based targets, as the SBTi has worked in for 5 years now, and the science-based net zero targets? I think the answer, again, is, if you just want to think about it visually, is science-based targets is 5 to 15-year targets to reduce the emissions above the x-axis, so abatement targets. And then the net zero targets are for companies that are taking science-based action on their own emissions, and they want to go further and make sure they contribute to the global transition in a way that recognizes their responsibility and their ability to accelerate global transition. And that's net zero targets that then build on, for example, voluntary carbon markets of efficiently and credibly allocating that additional capacity. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot more detail to talk about in the paper. Perhaps we can touch on some areas later in the discussion. Important to note that this was a first step. It sets out the clear principles for what net zero targets should look like, but there's of course a lot more nuance. And those of you that are quite engaged in corporate climate action will understand that there's a lot of nuance to questions around how Scope 3 emissions versus Scope 1 emissions should be reduced, how different mechanisms like compensation and utilization should be applied to different sources of emissions. And that's something we're still figuring out at the moment. And this is the timeline for this process. So we're currently drafting a first draft of net zero criteria that we're publishing by the end of the month. We're doing it together with an expert advisory group that includes some leading experts around these issues in the world. For example, also Owen, who will be speaking later from the gold standards on that group. And we're then, through a public consultation process and a really inclusive stakeholder process, are going to start refining these criteria and also developing a clear guidance that goes beyond these criteria, ultimately trying to build a similar framework to what the Science Based Targets Initiative has in place for emission reduction targets for net zero targets, where companies can submit the targets to SBTi for an independent validation, and stakeholders can have peace of mind that these targets are indeed aligned with science. And I think that was my last slide, and I only went slightly over time, I think.
Brilliant. I love it. Thanks, Alex. Thanks so much. We do have some questions, but we'll take them all at the end. And just a reminder for myself to tell everybody on the line that please do share your questions through the Q&A function. We'll take those at the end for all panelists. So thanks very much. And I'd like to now invite Sonia Gibbs to share both the objectives and key recommendations from the recent task force on scaling the voluntary carbon market. Sonia, over to you.
Step one.
So we don't hear, I think you're on mute, Sonia.
Still on mute. Okay, try again. First step, unmute, and very sorry for that. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. And let me just say up front that we are tremendously grateful to Gold Standard and for all the support for the work of the task force. We really couldn't have done it without you. So I wanted to give a bit of background on the voluntary task force on scaling carbon markets. And I want to draw here the parallel to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, because the two initiatives are very similar in their conception, in that Mark Carney initiated them both, but they're both also very clearly private sector led. So that's an important point to remember. So Mark approached Bill Winters, who is the CEO of Standard Chartered, to be the task force chair. And he approached us at the IIF, we're the Institute of International Finance, to be the project sponsor. So we had to ask, you know, when Mark Carney came to us, what do you mean by project sponsor? What even is that? So essentially what it means is kind of convening, socializing, and bringing the private financial sector to the table to work on scaling these carbon markets. The IIF, just for reference, has about 450 members in 75 countries. It's across the whole financial services spectrum, so banks, institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. But we also have about 70 public sector members, so development finance institutes, multilaterals, the EBRD. All of these are part of the IIF, and that's important in how we approach projects like this from a very public-private sector standpoint. So we have Standard Chartered ourselves, McKinsey are providing a tremendous amount of support, and then we're also working closely with the COP team in Mark Carney's office. So that's our operating team for this task force. And the impetus is really clear, right? I mean, we need practical tools to mobilize finance for low carbon and resilient transition. And as you all know very well, this is going to require a whole economy transition. And what keeps the economy going and capital flowing is the financial sector. So the financial sector, every company, every bank, insurer, investor, we've all got to adjust our business models. And scaling voluntary carbon markets is going to be, make no mistake, a phenomenal effort. Part of the reason why we're doing this, investors very clearly are demanding transition plans and very granular information about how companies are going to reach their targets. So our blueprint for scaling voluntary carbon markets is part of these transition plans. And as Sarah mentioned, companies, especially in hard to abate sectors, are going to have to offset their emissions. And that's going to create a real surge in demand for credible offsets. And one key pain point, I think we're referring to it in consultant speak, is that the credibility of voluntary carbon offsets in transition plans is really open to scrutiny, and that's not going to change. So we have to facilitate scaling up and global decarbonization. You've got to have a large, transparent, verifiable, and robust voluntary carbon market. And one point I think that's very important to us at the IIF, we do an awful lot of work with emerging markets. About half of our members are from emerging markets. It's scaling up voluntary carbon markets is going to help support financial flows to developing countries. Activities and projects in these countries are the most cost-effective source of carbon emissions reductions. So that really kind of gets to another set of sustainable development goals. So back to our task force that was convened in September, bringing together experts across the entire carbon market value chain. We have over 20 sectors of the economy represented and 6 continents, and a massive amount of experience from the people in the task force, got a tremendous amount of expertise. We also have a consultative group that brings in more experts and observers, including NGOs and development banks. So we've been working really fast, as Ewan will be able to tell you, to drop a roadmap to build the market infrastructure to build a fully functional voluntary market. We now have a full consultation document. Very happy to share the link for that. It's on our website, and we very much invite feedback. So anyone who would like to tackle the document, it's 147 pages, but you can just kind of go with the executive summary and answer the questions, and it'll be okay. So please do respond. So the recommendations aim to identify the infrastructure solutions that we're going to need to scale up markets. And these are recommendations for the private sector. So importantly, we are not getting into policy recommendations, and that's a direct steer from Mark Carney, who wants this to be focused very squarely on what the private sector can do. And so we have found 6 key areas where efforts are required to achieve this large, transparent, verifiable, and robust carbon market. So these themes are, first, establishing core carbon principles, to develop exchange-traded core carbon reference contracts, to build out market infrastructure, to ensure offset legitimacy, market integrity, and demand signaling. This is important, right? I mean, it's not a case of, if you build it, they will come. There has to be, we have to ensure that there's demand for these offsets. So really, this is a tremendous opportunity. And I'll just now say a few words about our scope and some of the big questions that we've been getting. So first of all, carbon credits, just a word on that. If you when purchased voluntarily, they enable firms to either compensate or neutralize their emissions that are not yet eliminated by financing avoidance reduction from other sources or the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So, and as you know, and as has been mentioned earlier, the projects that generate these emissions reductions, we've got broadly two categories, either those that focus on avoidance and reduction of emissions like renewable energy or methane capture, and second, removal or sequestration like reforestation or technology-driven carbon capture. So then we have spent a lot of time in the task force also thinking about the different co-benefits, because when you're sort of trying to think about a benchmark, right, like WTI or Brent crude in the oil market, when you think about a benchmark for carbon, really what is needed is something very standard so you can generate volume and have a lot of depth and liquidity in the market. You need some standardization. However, you know, these are infinitely complex, these carbon offsets. So there are all kinds of different co-benefits that you need to price as well, like biodiversity, job creation, support for local communities, health benefits from avoided pollution. I think here, you know, as you think about the pricing and the exchange traded contracts and the market infrastructure, it's important to note also on the scope, we're not seeing offsetting as a substitute for direct emissions reductions. It's a complement. And I think that's a very important point to remember. And it's important that offsetting that forms part of any climate commitments is done through high integrity carbon avoidance, reduction, and removal sequestration projects. So as a first step, our task force has designed a blueprint for a voluntary carbon market that does a number of things. It connects the supply of carbon credits to demand in what we hope will be a seamless and cost-effective and transparent way. It should instill confidence and ensure credibility in carbon credits that are being exchanged, and is scalable. And that's I think one of the key points of the task force. Task force now has about 50 members. Our consultative group broadens that out to a further 100 plus. And this is really important to connect initiatives in this area being done around the world. You know, and the more we continue with this work, the more we are receiving inquiries from other groups who are working on some of these same problems. So a big part of our role is to try to connect these dots. And we have 4 principles for the work of the task force. One is that we're going to produce open source solutions for private sector firms to take this forward. And the voluntary carbon markets must have high environmental integrity and minimize risk of negative consequences, so do no harm. And importantly, the task force is going to amplify the ongoing work of parallel initiatives, not be duplicative. And then finally, the task force work is predicated on the principle that voluntary carbon markets must not disincentivize companies' own emissions reductions efforts. So finally, on scope, we get a lot of questions about our scope. We are not taking up, for example, the issue of offsetting in the context of decarbonization strategies, because this is being addressed by other initiatives involving climate scientists and business experts. We want to leverage existing work and point to the need for other relevant expert bodies to take on a number of roles that this task force will not. It's squarely focused on the market piece of it. And then, of course, the connection with the regulatory and compliance markets. We do, of course, recognize that regulatory decisions like the international climate policy architecture will affect the outcome of these efforts to scale up. And obviously, there are a number of compliance and markets in existence. ETS in the EU, there's China ETS, California's cap and trade, and all of that. Those aren't covered in this report, but we have clear linkages to the voluntary carbon markets. So what next? Our longer term goals are very clear. Massive scaling up of carbon markets is going to be an integral part of reaching global climate goals. And getting to net zero is going to require every corner of the global economic and financial system to play a part. So government policies have their role, businesses and households have their role, buyers have their role. Carbon markets need to be built, and we believe that the private financial sector holds the key to that. So Sarah, I'll stop there and turn back over to you. Happy to take any questions in due course.
Sonia. Oh, thanks a lot, Sonia. I did the same thing and didn't unmute myself before talking. Great. So we have really great overviews of the two of these forces that I mentioned at the top. I'd now like to invite Owen Hewlett, our Chief Technical Officer here at Gold Standard, to reflect on those, maybe starting with the Foundations for Net Zero paper that Alex has given us a brief on today.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Alex and Sonia. I think just on science-based targets, so Gold Standard's a long-time supporter. We were there when it was launched, and as Alex mentioned, I sit on the expert group and the technical advisory group, and very, very proud and privileged to do that. And I think you can tell from that introduction that what struck us with science-based targets when it was released in Paris in 2015 was it shifts the conversation from the arbitrary, I can come up with my own target for reduction as a company or as an individual even, to the non-arbitrary. This is what I must achieve if we're going to get there and avert the climate emergency. And so very much welcome the latest thinking on net zero, which continues that conversation of a non-arbitrary target setting and theory of change. And one of the things I like about it very much is I think it's also one of the very first meaningful efforts to holistically think about the different targets and mechanisms for change that a company has in front of them and can make use of, and starting to think about how they can be used. That's really the part where we start to see where markets are in relation to internal and external company targets. That is a huge lift, a huge contribution, I think, to the discourse. Clearly, things like terminology, claims, how to think about the nuance of market use cases around that needs further refinement, as Alex said. But just in terms of seeing the whole picture, or maybe flip that around. Historically, what science-based targets has said is that you can't offset towards your science-based targets, fully support that. But the absence of what you can do with those markets in that discourse has led to a void being filled by individual actors. And when you do that, you get, greenwashing claims right through to brilliant claims. But what you don't have is any real consistency. So hugely applaud it. One other comment on science-based targets, I would say, is that although it positions, it correctly positions per the mitigation hierarchy, internal company reductions as a priority, the thinking around neutralization versus compensation and the options that companies have available to them, that signal around what net zero meant led to a bit of a gold rush, I think, towards nature-based solutions and removals, which, those things have a role to play and will be important. But I think overall, the next decade between now and 2030 should be the decade of emission reduction, internal and external. We may never get to worry about how many removals we generate if we don't vastly ramp that up. Or again, put another way, we may end up removing things that we should be reducing, and it becomes inefficient. So I think to be applauded, very much looking forward to get stuck in terms of how markets can support different moving parts of that and the claims, etc. On the task force, I think, thanks Sonia for the overview and for inviting me into that one as well. I think, when I think about carbon markets more broadly, what we're seeing is a fragmentation or a diversification, maybe a more positive word, of use cases. So offsetting and voluntary markets tends to be conflated as a term, but offsetting is a use case of markets rather than the markets. And Sonia mentioned other uses of markets like domestic compliance, sectoral compliance, country to country transfers. And I think between what we're doing in the task force and what Alex is leading over at science-based targets, we need to make sure we're driving the right market use case for the right part of the framework, either in Paris or in companies, and cognizant of the other. And that's really when we start to hold offsetting to account. So the task force trying to scale voluntary carbon markets is great. Scale on its own is valueless. If we scale the wrong thing and we're duplicative, then we don't make any difference. My biggest fear isn't that we don't raise enough finance or take enough action. I think those things, the pressure will ramp up, and the noise around it and the commitment to do it will ramp up. My bigger kind of worst nightmare scenario is that we do raise enough finance to have resolved the climate emergency, but we fail because we misuse the mechanisms that we have in front of us. And I think that's what we really need to think about. And then just thinking about that in the task force, there's two areas, apart from thinking about use cases for the right solution, the two areas we can really influence quality in the market are setting that minimum criteria for what a carbon credit asset is. And I'm delighted and very proud, I think, to see safeguarding in there, sustainable development in there, as we were with CORSIA. I really feel like Gold Standard played a big role in getting that discourse moving over the last 20 years. So we can really start to push the quality in those core provisions. But we also need to continue to raise the ceiling, if you like, showing that, if that's the least you should be doing, then you can also aim higher, and providing the incentives and the quality for that as well within carbon markets. So yeah, those would be my main reflections: use cases for the right purpose, and unpick that complexity and make sure we're thinking holistically, and then looking at the quality floor and the quality ceiling, both increasing. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Owen. Maybe could you just give in 1 or 2 minutes a word on how Gold Standard is looking at positioning itself moving into the post-2020, the era of the Paris framework?
Yeah, sure. Just super quickly then. So clearly we'll need to align all market issuance and labeling bodies like ourselves with those core provisions, and obviously we'll advocate for raising that floor and aligning and being consistent with it. We also want to respond meaningfully to the diversification of markets and make sure that we issue a unit that is consistent wherever it's being applied, noting that some of the top kind of provisions might be variable. To do that, we need to align with the Paris Agreement. We've sort of kept the Paris Agreement at arm's length in both science-based targets and the task force. But we, aside from use cases for the right purposes, we also need to not undermine the ambition of the Paris Agreement, especially with markets, which is definitely a possibility. There's a definite risk that a 15 times larger voluntary carbon market starts to influence the way countries set domestic policies, which could be good, it could be bad, and we need to make sure that we deal with that properly. So we'll align with Paris, and we'll look to provide the toolbox for thinking about bringing things like additionality and baseline to Paris alignment so that they can be applied in a variety of markets. And then the thing we're known for is sustainable development. On the other side will be our safeguards already align with UNDP and IFC safeguards. So if anybody's wondering how to do safeguards and meet those CORSIA requirements and the task force provisions in a meaningful way, come talk to us. And we'll also be releasing SDG impact reporting tools by the end of the year for road testing, which kind of brings the co-benefit side to the next generation as well. And just on co-benefits, I often get asked if that's just a complexity that markets don't need. But honestly, by the time you've dealt with safeguards and included stakeholders, the co-benefits, that becomes the easy part to deal with. The safeguards are the ones that are that's where the complexity lies. That's what we need to get right. Co-benefits isn't where the complexity lies, and we should take full advantage of that.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about what these initiatives, dynamics, how they influence business strategy. We have two companies with us that have very different business models and yet are both kind of on the leading edge of climate ambition. What does this mean for you? What are your reflections on these new developments? Does it change your approach or not? Maybe, Jim, could we turn to you first and talk about how Novartis is thinking about this?
Sure, absolutely. And first of all, thanks to you, Sarah, and to Gold Standard for putting this panel together today. This is a really important topic because if you're a commercial and an industrial firm like Novartis, we make life-saving medicine. There's consumption of energy that's going to happen, and it's going to continue to happen. We'll have unavoidable emissions and residual emissions based on what we do, and the value to saving lives is you can't put a price on that, and we can't delay. But we have to figure out how to be more sustainable in how we design, deliver medicines all over the world, understanding our impact on the globe and the impact of climate change on our patient population. So as a company, we've got an approved science-based target, which is a 1.5 degree scenario target of 35% reduction in absolute emissions across our entire value chain. So scopes 1, 2, and 3. And we've been engaged in efficiency for a very long time. We've been engaged in forestry projects for removals for about 12 to 13 years. We've got locations in Colombia, Argentina, Mali, and China, and have been working on those. And we recognized that we needed to pick up the pace and move beyond our previous generation goals, get to carbon neutrality in own operations by 2025. In September, the CEO announced that we're going to push for decarbonization across our entire value chain by 2030. So pretty ambitious goals. The reality is companies have to invest in efficiency, which we do. That's either in technology or behaviors. Companies have to shift to renewables wherever they can, whether it's on-site renewables, whether it's power purchase agreements, virtual power purchase agreements. And we leverage virtual power purchase agreements because of the complexity of our business, where we see shifting industrial footprint, where we have mergers and acquisitions. We know we're always changing. So leveraging virtual power purchase agreements to decarbonize our procured electricity is a big tool. We have a virtual power purchase agreement in the US that makes our procured electricity carbon-free. And we have been working in Europe on similar deals. As a matter of fact, I would say keep an eye out for a press release within the next week, releasing details on a big step forward for us in Europe. Those are important. But you have to do all those things with dropping your emissions through efficiency, shifting to renewables, and work on setting up credible and transparent carbon removals at the same time. We topped over 418 parts per million in the atmosphere for carbon earlier this year. 350 obviously is the safe-ish level. So even as we drive towards reducing our emissions through efficiency, we have to develop in parallel the ability to remove. We have to do this in a way that takes into account the social impact of those projects, strive to deliver a co-benefit of health in a local population, climate resilience in a local population, biodiversity in a local ecosystem. These are all critical things for the health of the planet and thus the health of our patients as well. Because we really are focused on coming back to what's that patient impact, what's that patient outcome, and doing what we need to do to bend the curve of life in a positive way, which means we need to address this. So the fact that we're looking to scale these, to make them more transparent, to make them more credible, is huge, because we have to get beyond the emotional discussion of offsets. And we have to get to the point where we can unlock corporate capital, leverage corporate capital, and do it in a way that doesn't mean that we're buying up plots of land to do this, but instead financing local projects with local staff, local labor, local resources, and we help induce positive, effective, enduring change, as opposed to having a negative unintended consequence to those projects. So this is a great discussion, and looking forward to the questions as well.
Great. So you mentioned removals, that's core to your strategy beyond boundaries. So I want to come back to that, and I know that there's a lot of questions around that. Owen's commented on it as well as Alex, and so let's come back to that. But first, I'd like to hear from Zelda and talk about how Aviva is looking at these recent developments and maybe reflecting on how it comports with your climate strategy.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So yeah, does it consolidate our approach? Yes, it certainly does. We have been reducing our carbon impact of our operations, so scope 1, 2, and our business travel and waste and water of scope 3 since 2006. We got the board to agree to offset those emissions back then. The first time we went to the board, we said we want to offset our emissions. Is that okay? And they kind of said, what do we get for that? And we said, well, you get a certificate if you want one of those. And they said, go away and think about it a bit further and come back to us. And then when we talked about the sustainable development part of it, the value that it could bring in terms of livelihoods, in terms of reducing indoor pollution, in terms of improving health, that was the tipping point for our board. And the kind of co-benefits that we talked about before are as important to us as the way we carbon offset. So as I say, we've been doing that over the last, 14 years now. And with the TCFD coming in 2017, we were on the TCFD task force, putting together those recommendations. But we have been looking at our own climate risks going forwards from an investment point of view, which is slightly different to a lot of other sectors, and the impact that makes, as well as our purchasing and supply chain area. Those investment area is enormous because we are picking up the responsibility for all the rest of the companies that we invest in and their scopes. So what do we do about those? How do we reduce those? First and foremost, how do we encourage those companies to reduce those? And then what do we do with the residual that we can't get those companies to reduce? We signed up to the UN Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance back in December last year. And we're working together with others because none of us have the solution to getting to net zero. So we are building that methodology, that target setting, that engagement process to help us get there. So yes, very much decarbonisation before, whether it's our own operations or whether it's through engagement. We think offsetting has a key role to play. It's a way of, we look at it as a boat which is sinking, and the offsets are the plug in the hole whilst we continue to bail and whilst we continue to reduce our own emissions. So it fits very well with our ambitions to be net zero. We need those measurements to be robust. We're an insurance company and therefore we're very cautious. And we know that we will be held to account by our shareholders and our customers if we are offsetting in any way that isn't the most robust way. So we are very keen on that, and the independent standards like the gold standard are key to providing that robustness.
Thanks so much, Zelda. I mean, I heard from both of you the value of co-benefits and those being, verified and credibly measured. Zelda, maybe reflecting on some of the work of the task force that Sonia had outlined, one of the objectives is to reach a reference contract. And while Sonia did acknowledge that we do need to be able to account for variation, we do see some reference contracts coming into play now that are based on, for example, Corsia, their eligibility criteria, which while it does set a fairly good floor, it still flattens an asset into a derivative that can't distinguish between a household biogas in a community in Africa versus an industrial process that might meet that minimum requirement, but is a totally different thing. So is that something that Aviva would look for, or what are your reflections on that?
Yes, very much so. For ourselves, for our own operations, we aren't carbon intensive. We don't emit large amounts of carbon, and we're reducing our emissions that we do emit year on year, and we've reduced it by 66% since 2010. So to obtain carbon offsets from highly carbon intensive companies is a bit, are we doing our work? Are we doing their work for them? And we're a people focused company. So why wouldn't we support communities that are looking to reduce their carbon emissions in a way that has those co-benefits, those improvements to livelihoods, women's empowerment and health. It just sits so well with us, an insurance company. And I've had interesting conversations with our procurement team, because they say, oh, we can get the price down on this. We can purchase carbon offsets that are very cheap. But when it comes to this kind of thing, it isn't about price. It's about the quality and the difference that it will make. And we believe that, you know, we need to concentrate on that rather than on, you know, how transactional we can make something.
Right. Yes. Well, you're speaking our language, and that's one of the biggest concerns that our stakeholders, you know, gold standard project developers go through a lot more trouble to make sure they're following those safeguards, engaging local stakeholders, and designing in and monitoring and verifying those SDG benefits. So it's good to know that there are companies that hold that as a high objective. And I see you nodding as well, Jim. So if you want to comment on that, but there's also a question that's come through targeted to you about the criteria that are important to you when you consider choosing the right carbon removals, and how you choose from different solutions. And I know Novartis has a unique approach here, so happy to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and one of the things too, we have done a number of different things in the past, and we're actually building out a more diversified portfolio of carbon removals now through natural climate solutions. And what we're focused on, you know, is there additionality? Is this really something that's going to be new and impactful? What's the measurability? What's the verification process? How auditable is it? How transparent is it? Because we have to be able to hold up real science and real data and real results and say that we made change happen. And if you can't do that, then that's not the right project for us. No leakage. You know, what's the longevity of a project? What are the social co-benefits, the environmental co-benefits, the economic co-benefits, the health co-benefits? You know, how can we build a structure of these that are more aligned physically with the location of our patient populations, that are more aligned with location of some of our operations? You know, that becomes a little complex because a lot of our operations are in Europe and in India and in China. So then it becomes a debate on, well, where do we want to do these? And how closely do we align with where our physical operations are as opposed to where our patients are? And how do we align within a market where we get more impact from doing a project in a particular location from not just a carbon removal perspective, but biodiversity and increased social impact? So these are all the kind of things that we look at and we balance. And as we consider regenerative agriculture, mangrove restoration, blue carbon projects, you know, every single thing that we're looking at, it's a balancing act between those to try to get a nicely balanced mix of impact. And, you know, it's kind of the it depends answer, and it really does depend. And it depends on where we've made progress already and where we see, you know, we haven't done enough related to biodiversity co-benefits. So let's focus here. And that's going to be the next 10 years. Obviously, these take time to mature and to scale up and to deliver the results. So we are going through a strategic review on how to build a diversified portfolio and to start executing end of next year in that expansion, knowing that we have to give them time to ramp up at the same time we're reducing our emissions so that they meet appropriately at the end of those two cycles.
Yeah, that is one of the unique challenges with nature-based carbon removals, is the long time frame and making sure that we are preparing readiness now for having supply and future climate impact. So since carbon removals is such a hot topic, there is a question that's come in, maybe could be reflected from both Jim and from Alex. There's a concept shared that, what do you think about the idea of limiting the use of carbon removal credits? I think potentially to address some of the challenges that Owen mentioned, which is we don't want to forget that we also need to avoid emissions. So this is positioned as a sort of reverse science-based targets, where companies would have a carbon sink development target compatible with the science and their reduction target. In other words, kind of provide more detail or regulation in the use of offsets. Open the floor to anyone to respond to that, but if Jim and Alex, you want to take a first crack at it.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's the right point. In order to do this well and credibly, you have to be putting effort into the efficiency and into the renewables and reducing your absolute emissions. It goes without saying. And it may be, currently, if you take a look at how offsets are allowed to interact with science-based targets, in order to really unlock more private capital and corporate capital, it probably needs to become in the future that you set up a structure or a framework where if a company does X percentage in efficiency, Y percentage in renewables, that opens up Z as the third opportunity associated with carbon removals, and that you create a standard and an expectation that, okay, you can get to net zero. I mean, do all the carbon removals what you want, but also tie it into corporate structure, formal corporate targets, science-based targets, by saying, if you hit this standard in these areas, you can then build this as part of an integrated portfolio to reduce your impact and reduce your footprint. And Alex, curious for your thoughts on that.
Well, I think there's actually two different questions almost in there. One is about whether companies should have removal targets, so the equivalent to the abatement targets almost. And I think it's an interesting question and something we've thought about as well. There's a bit of a question of what the allocation logic is. There's a very obvious way of allocating or attributing emission to companies through accounting and then ask them to reduce them over time. But on what basis you would distribute out responsibility for removals is a more challenging question, I think. And there is the question whether a more simple approach where you incentivize investments in voluntary carbon markets is perhaps more straightforward. And that could hint at the second part of the question, which is, should there be clearer guidance on what proportion of your investments in voluntary carbon markets should be in removals versus other types of mitigation outcomes? And should that maybe change over time, right? And actually, there's an interesting paper by Oxford University, the Oxford Offsetting Principles, quite controversial on some aspects of it. But one of the proposals they make is this type of sliding scale. They don't put numbers on it because that's the difficult part, I guess. But there's a suggestion that different types of investments are preferable at different points in time. And we have looked at different types of scenarios or modeling efforts that give you a hint of what that distribution could look like. But yeah, I think the long story short is that it's quite complex to make these types of calls. And maybe a broader piece around this, and also around, I suppose, Owen's, I think, criticism to some extent of the position of the SBTi around removals, particularly in the original version. I think there's certain dilemmas in here, and you can only optimize for certain things within a complex system like this. And there's, for example, the Oxford principles are a really great effort of reflecting back what happens in the scenarios to the corporate level. I think what they fall a bit short is, and we fell a bit short, certainly in the beginning, is thinking about what incentives are set by, for example, categorically speaking about removals as the thing that's important to reach a zero. In a way, if you look at the scenarios, that is what's true, but if you make this categorical preference for them, then you're setting the incentive for removal investments over other mitigation outcomes. So there's like certain trade-offs in what we're trying to achieve that are not easily resolved, and which is part of why we're having this complex stakeholder process, because it's not just for the SBTi to make that decision. We want to make sure that that reflects a broad range of stakeholders and their views.
So we'll stay tuned for that, Alex. I'm sure it will be all crystal clear when the future guidance comes out. Owen can help you sort all of that out, right?
It's all on Owen, actually.
Yeah, right. So we're approaching time, but for those who can stay on, both panelists and attendees, panelists, if you have other obligations, please feel free to drop off. But there are a few other, at least two other questions I'd love to pose, if I may. One is around kind of that legitimacy question. And Sonia, you mentioned it when you talked about the task force objectives. So for companies choosing not to reduce emissions or offset them and ignoring net zero and science-based targets altogether, what is the price that they pay? How serious is that for their future growth and ability to borrow? Actually, I would say maybe think about that with those who choose only to offset and not to reduce their emissions. Does this have any consequence, say, in the financial world or among investors? And maybe Zelda, you can also comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. In that, you know, companies like ourselves, our investment arm of Viva Investors, are asking companies to produce their TCFD report. They are increasingly asking them to sign up to science-based targets as part of their engagement process. If they don't sign up, depending on how carbon intensive they are and how large they are, etc., it could mean that as an institutional investor, we vote against them for their annual reports and accounts, or against their directors in the AGM. So we would obviously encourage companies to do that. I don't know whether there's something in there for the largest carbon emitters in terms of a kind of a producer responsibility, and it may come down to regulation in the end. It's something that we don't particularly want to see, because companies don't react very well to regulation, and it's better to be ahead of the game and listen to what your investors are asking you to do rather than what government's asking you to do. But it may well come to that in the end.
Great, thanks. Sonia, yes?
So, you know, it's an interesting question, and I would just point out two things here, and along the lines of how markets work. I think increasingly ESG considerations are being factored into credit ratings, and these matter greatly for a company's cost of funding, right? So if you look at the integrity of buyers and how well and how verifiably they're going after emissions targets, how credible these targets are, that's going to become part and parcel of their kind of public perception and more codified in credit ratings. And credit ratings ultimately determine the price of credit. So long story short, if you're not doing a good job, if you're not making, you know, credible progress toward the targets that you've set, that's going to be reflected in your credit ratings and in your cost of capital. And now that climate risk is being clearly defined as a financial risk, and firms are being asked to manage these risks, both the kind of physical, transition, you know, reputational risks. If that's not being done, that will hurt.
So Sonia, just to follow up, so if companies are, let's say, making a commitment to offsetting their residual emissions, does that look better to an investor because they're pricing in potential regulation, or does that have does that play a role from that perspective?
I think it's still a very new assessment process, I think, and I'm not an investor, don't want to speak for folks like Zelda here, but I think if you're looking at corporate commitments, you know, you have to be able to evaluate those commitments, and we're still figuring out how best to do that. But I do think it will be reflected in the pricing.
Great, and maybe one last question. We've touched on it already, but it talks about, again, that commodification of voluntary carbon offsets. So Zelda has already commented on how they look at that. I think we see that Jim agrees that they really need to see the detail. And Sonia, you mentioned that the task force will be open source. How do you envision this playing out? I mean, if we do see derivatives like the global emission offset takeoff, and it really flattens the view of carbon offsets, which are not really apples to apples, how does the task force see that taking shape in the future to make sure that we're incentivizing the high hanging fruit and the really high impact offsetting?
So the central goal of the task force is to develop this sort of core contract, right? You have to be able to have a baseline to grow a market. It is clear that as the market develops, there will be a whole, spreads of different attributes that will be priced around the benchmark. And we fully expect that will develop and develop richly, different exchanges, different jurisdictions will develop different variations on the theme, and all of this will be part and parcel of market development. But the key and the most important thing, first and foremost, is to get that core contract in place.
Sure. So I know that Owen and our team and our colleagues at WWF will be advocating very strongly for market infrastructure that allows that, real clear visibility and enables the high-hanging fruit, and not just chase. I mean, we do want to chase the lowest cost abatement. We need climate action all over, but to make sure that project developers are incentivized to go that extra mile to develop really high impact projects. And as Sonia mentioned, from the task force, to send that demand signal, because they take all the risk at this moment to develop these projects, bring them online in hopes that they meet the market. So those long-term demand signals, not just for carbon credits, but for high impact, high integrity credits will be really important. So I see a lot of nodding. I hope that my panelists agree. I think we'll wrap it up here. I'd like to thank all of you very much. It's really great to hear your inputs and reflections on this really dynamic space. We'll have more conversations in the future as things continue to evolve and new guidance emerges. So thanks very much. Look forward to revisiting these topics again in the future.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.